field that is being used as a replacement for animal therapy in nursing homes, which is really kind of awesome.
So she builds planets on Earth, you guys.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our very special program, Finding Latinx. I'm James Monroe. I'm the producer of adult programs at the Museum of Science, Boston, and I'm so honored to be introducing our special guests tonight. We are joined by Paola Ramos, the author of the incredible book that's at the center of our conversation tonight, Finding Latinx, in search of the voices redefining Latino identity. And she will be joined in conversation by Rosario Ubiera Minaya, who is the executive director of Amplify Latinx, which is an incredible organization here in Boston. And together, the two of them are going to have an amazing conversation all about this fantastic book and the communities all across our country who are reclaiming the term Latinx. And I am so appreciative and thankful to both of them for being here tonight, agreeing to participate in this conversation, and letting us share it all with you. Before we begin, I just do want to note we had hoped that tonight we would be able to offer both English and Spanish captioning for this conversation. Unfortunately, due to last-minute technical issues, we were not able to make this happen. However, we will be sending this video off for post-captioning in both English and Spanish and getting this up on the museum's YouTube page as soon as possible so that everyone can enjoy it. Once again, we apologize, but we will have that back on site in both languages in the very near future. And tonight is a part of our current winter-spring season of virtual programming at the museum. We still have a lot of great lineup to go. Every week now through the end of May, we are here with a different free virtual event or experience. So I encourage you to check out that full lineup by going to mos.org/adults. And you can check out what we have coming up and register for your spot and spend your spring with us here virtually at the museum. And tonight is also a collaboration with our friends at MOS en Español, which is an amazing initiative and team that has continued to grow over the past year here at the museum. We are collaborating with them on 3 really special events as a part of our current season, and tonight is the first. And we are lucky enough to have a member of their team here with us to talk a little bit more about their work. So please join me in welcoming from MOS en Español, Francisca.
Hola a todos y bienvenidos al Museo de Ciencia. Qué emoción poder darles la bienvenida en español. Yo soy Francisca, soy chilena y soy parte de un pequeño pero poderoso equipo de 4 personas responsables por traerles programación en español y poco a poco extendiendo estas oportunidades por el resto del museo. We're so excited that from our humble beginnings as weekly Spanish program, we're now getting to collaborate with adult programs with this special event created with the Latinx community in mind. We hope that you enjoyed tonight's program because we sure will. And for our Spanish-speaking community, para nuestra comunidad hispanohablante, los invitamos a seguirnos en Facebook en MOS en Español para estar al tanto de todo nuestro contenido virtual y también los jueves a las 3 de la tarde cada 2 semanas. Nos pueden encontrar en vivo para presentaciones especiales con animales, de la ciencia en acción y con unos educadores que están listos para responder todas sus preguntas. Así que ojalá nos vemos de nuevo and enjoy tonight.
Thank you so much, Francisca, and everyone on Team MOS en Español. It's been a joy to collaborate. We look forward to so much more of it in the future. Now, I'll be back a little bit later on for a Q&A with our speakers. So if you have a question for either of them, you can submit that at any time by going to slido.com and using the code Finding Latinx, all one word, just as it is showing up on your screen right now. Once again, that's Slido, SLIDO.com, with the code Finding Latinx, all one word. I need to thank our friends from the Lowell Institute for making tonight possible. It is because of them that we are here and that this event is free for all of you. So please join me in giving a huge virtual round of applause and thanks to the Lowell Institute. And finally, I ask all of you after the talk tonight to go to donate.mos.org/MOS at home and consider making a gift to allow us to keep bringing free programming just like this into your homes virtually. Once again, that's donate.mos.org/MOS at home. But now it is my honor and privilege to turn it over and welcome to the stream our special guests tonight. Take it away, Paola and Rosario.
Good evening, everyone. Muy buenas noches. Thank you so much to the Museum of Science and the MOS en Español team for inviting us. I'm speaking on behalf of Paola. I want to do a little introduction before I bring Paola into the conversation. I'm so excited about this opportunity to have this exchange as I'm going through a journey of finding my identity right now. So this book came in perfect timing, and I'm so much looking forward to this conversation. I do want to frame it around my experience, so I'll do a little bit of that, and then Paola, I'll bring you in. But I do want to say that as I continue growing professional and spiritually, and most recently through my role as executive director for Amplify Latinx, I've been on the role for 2 years. I'm often asked what defines my leadership style, and what's my compass, and how I'm finding my voice. So as I find myself reflecting on my journey so far, I'm a community activist. I'm a change maker. I've been called that. Also a disruptor, and I wear that label proudly. I'm also a social entrepreneur, and I focus my work in all of those areas in social justice and community empowerment, and for the mobility of Black and Brown communities in Massachusetts. There's so many interrelated and interconnected identities that come to light when I talk about myself and when I think about myself. But I'm also a formerly undocumented immigrant. I'm an English language learner with my accent that takes me into so many rooms and places. I'm a Black Latina. I'm a college graduate, a daughter, a sister, a mother. I'm a creative and also a provider. I've been a pioneer in some areas. I've been the first in some opportunities, but I'm also a follower in others. I'm a dreamer overall. And I have rarely seen myself as I was growing up represented in a positive light as the person that I feel I am, and the identities I can relate to. So not only here as I was growing up in the United States, but also back in my native land, my island in the Dominican Republic. I'm also a voter, an advocate, a leader, and I'm Latinx. So that's why I'm saying this is like perfect timing, because Latinx as a term has been the word that I feel I can most, it can encompass most of my identities. I'm gonna introduce Paola. Paola is the host and correspondent for Vice and Vice News, and she's also a contributor to Telemundo News and MSNBC. And she spent over 2 years exploring the changing nature of the Latinx identity. As James mentioned, today we are framing this conversation around Paola's book, Finding Latinx. And through that book, Paola presents a travelogue with stories from the Latinx community members across the United States. Paola, what a pleasure to meet you, to share the space with you and poder conversar contigo.
Igualmente. And honestly, I have to say, like, that was the way that you just described, like, your own journey. I think that's sort of the point of the book and of this conversation. I think for so many years, like, no one could put what you just said in a label. Like, it was completely undefined, right? I'm sure to the point that I can't even imagine how many times someone has been like, are you really Latina or are you Black? Like, right. So I just want to thank you for sharing that, and just for capturing the essence of this just so beautifully. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. No, and again, for me is as learning as I go to kind of like articulate who I feel I am as as a Latina, Afro-Latina, and Latinx in this country. But so I thank you for putting this book together, because I feel that is just the stories really express, the diversity of who we are as a community. As I was reading through the book, all sorts of emotions came up, of course. It moved me in many different ways. I felt empowered as I was reading it, but I also felt in some cases anger and frustrated, with some of the stories and some of the experiences that you narrated through the book. But I feel that, the way you wrote the book was so sincere and heartfelt, and you open up a window to your own journey, embracing your own identity. So with all of that we already have said, there's a lot to unpack tonight in this conversation. So I'm not sure how deep we're going to go with the time that we have and where the conversation is going to take us. But to start, I would like to know if you can share a little bit about, this term and what it means to you, what Latinx means to you. I've been using it for the past 4 years. And as I said, I'll continue kind of like exploring it. So can you talk a little bit about that, and also how the term lends itself to collective belonging, which I think is powerful.
Yeah, I mean, so the way I think that's like the beauty and also the curse of this word, that it remains to be so undefined, that's why I think people have had such a hard time wrapping their heads around it. So the way that I choose to define it is the X, right, that scares so many people, is nothing but an invitation to any Latino that has at any point in their lives ever felt left out of the 60 million of us, right? And that is, the Afro-Latinos that at some point were told that they're too Black to be Latinos, the queer Latinos that at some point were told that the way they loved didn't match the Latino traditional values, right? Trans Latinas that were told that they're not Latinas enough to be part of us. But also people like my own grandmother, right? That believes that she has more rights than those that at some point she was told she had. And so I think in this moment that this term and the vocabulary is the only word that is able to at least attempt to capture who the 60 million of us are in one label. We can get into why perhaps the term isn't perfect, but I think at least it pushes people to see all of us. And I think we've reached a point where we have to force each other to look at us through this lens, because if not, we're simply leaving too many people behind, which I think we're reaching that point where it could have these sort of long-term political and cultural impacts if we don't start recognizing exactly what it means to be us. And I think in terms of the like collective power, I think that's what we're starting to see now, right? Which is why I think it's still very hard to like pinpoint it exactly. But to me, I look at the 2020 president, I look at a couple of things. Like I look at the movement that happened this summer in the streets, like in the wake of George Floyd, and the way that suddenly I started seeing for the first time that like, young Afro-Latinos and young Latinos were in the streets, and for the first time looking at Black people and saying, tu lucha es mi lucha, right? Recognizing for the first time that like there are Black people among us in our community, right? And that Afro-Latinos too can die at the hands of the police. Like that is a shift that I think is happening. Even now when we're seeing at the border, right? Suddenly it's Latinos that are saying, but wait a second, like migrants can also be Afro-Cuban migrants, right? And even though I have papers, like I still, and I'm seeing it in my own Cuban family, like for the first time, they're making links between what it means to be them and what it means to be like someone at the border, because they're recognizing who they once were, And I think that's part of the problem where so many people have been able to forget where we come from. But anyways, yeah, that was a lot for one answer.
Yeah, no, that's great. In terms of the belonging piece, I recently learned about Powell's theory of othering and belonging. It's kind of like, all the similarities that bring us together, but also, the fact of the othering and how that has shaped systemically our society. And again, as I was reading through the book, I couldn't help to think about that and all of the parts that resonated with me as I'm also learning about other theories. Since I came to this country, like you mentioned earlier, I've been asked what am I? Who am I? And that experience, it was the one that prompted starting this journey for me, because I didn't know exactly where I belonged.
Right.
And throughout the whole experience, I've been I realized that I've been looking for communities, searching for a place that I can feel that I can be myself, and I can unapologetically like show up, right? So,
and that's one of the things that struck me so much, like exactly what you're describing is unfortunately a thread that I found among every single story, right? Which is very much shown in the stats, right? Like in 2018, the American Psychological Association did a study where they found that Latinos experience a different type of discrimination, many different types of discrimination, but one that's very specific to us is that Latinos believe that they are perpetual foreigners, that they are seen constantly by every other people as people that don't belong here. Even if you're born in this country, right? Even though that the majority of people below the age of 35, right? 80% of Latinos under the age of 35 are born in this country. Even those people still believe like that there is this like wall between us and them because they look at us as foreigners, no? And I think that's something that I found in every story, where there is this like very big ache to constantly have to prove like you belong in this country that tells the story of immigrants. Now, this is the country that welcomes immigrants, but there's this constant battle between like what that really means, no? So, So yeah, I found that everywhere.
Yeah. So I mentioned also my role with the organization that I'm leading, Amplify Latinx, and we lead a movement. We are building a coalition, and we through that work we want to build economic and political power for Latinos in Massachusetts. We do civic engagement, economic opportunity, and leadership representation, and it's a cross-sector, collaboration. But as a Latinx leader, I'm envisioning, the full representation of Latinos in decision-making roles, and through that theory, like we want to see economic and political equity for Latinos, right? But early on, I understood that I must be intentional about the driving the change I want to see. And as an Afro-Latina, representing the voices, that are in my community. But through Amplify Latinx is like striving to be the voice of the Latino community in Massachusetts. But I feel like leading that group, I always question, am I being inclusive of all the Latinx experiences? Who am I lifting through this kind of work and the narratives? So that's why I try to share my story. Yeah. Even though, sometimes I'm questioning many things because I know there's so many of us that have felt left out, especially in even movements that are, they're born in our own communities. So, again, through the book, I was able to kind of like start to answer some of the questions, but at the same time, it's still, in progress, right?
Completely. So I think so much of this, even for me, like so much of the journey of writing the book was all learning, and it was also like undoing so much of what I had been taught, no? And so I can, it's always a work in progress, especially now. So yeah, I can relate to that.
Yeah. So going back a little bit in history, maybe you can help me to understand some of the feelings around the Latinx term, because again, through the work that I'm doing, through owning the term and using it often, I see that it's controversial, and I see within our own communities so many people that don't agree with it. So can you talk a little bit about the history of the term? Where is it coming from? And give us a little context around that.
Yeah, so the term itself starts to pop up in these like in online circles in the early 2000s, no? And it's in like online chatters, and it started with the queer Latino community, in the early 2000s, where a lot of queer Latinos were very intentionally adding the X, right, to be inclusive of trans folks and non-binary folks. But I think the controversy starts that suddenly, you look at Google Trends, and then from early 2000s until now, the Google Trends of people trying to figure out what Latinx means keeps spiking and spiking and spiking and spiking. And that correlates with this debate that we're having, where we're suddenly, like, people beyond the queer Latino world, we're starting to use the word. No, and so that's where I always think about this. I'm like, if the term were simply a term to address queer folks, then we wouldn't even be really like having this conversation, and people would be satisfied with that. But then suddenly you have suddenly Afro-Latinos are using it, and undocumented folks are using it, and trans Latinos, and also, white Latinos and old Latinos and young Latinos. And so, and so that is where the confusion starts to some people. What's wrong with Hispanic? No, like, why are people suddenly rejecting that word? I mean, it's a word that I think was truly institutionalized in the Nixon administration. No, it was the Nixon administration that institutionalized this term. And again, in the word Hispanic, you're very much centering a word around España, no, y los españoles, and the folks that colonized in Latin America. So a lot of people obviously have problems with that. Latino, Latina, the Spanish language, is gendered. So you're automatically erasing a couple of people from that. Also in Hispanic, you're also erasing our whole history of Afrodescendientes. And so, Latinx, I think, at least starts to embrace everything that has been left behind. To me, what's really interesting is trying to understand the incredible rejection and hatred that there is towards the word. Because I think that to me is the interesting question, where suddenly, why do people hate this word so much? Is it because there's something about the image, the true image of who we are, that rubs people the wrong way? No, there is something about the image of of seeing yourself next to someone that is Black, and next to someone that is trans, and next to someone that is indigenous, liberal, or conservative. There's something about that image that people don't want to see. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is the interesting question of me pushing back and being all right, so let's unpack that. Because we grew up with so many internalized biases, right? And so many ideas of what it meant to be Latino that never included that image ever. And so at least Latinx forces you to see an image. And then we can talk about what that image looks like and why people don't like it. But at least Latinx, perfect or imperfect as it is, forces people to look at an image that they've never seen before.
Right. So to me, again, I use it proudly because I feel that it contributes to my vocabulary for disruption and resistance.
And how is it perceived in Massachusetts?
Through the work that I've been doing with Amplify, we get messages almost on a daily basis, complaining about the word, about what it represents, asking sometimes what it means to us, why we are naming our movement and our organization with that term. And so some people are just curious and they want to learn, but many others are just not having it, and they have, they share reasons around why, and most of them I feel, come from language and they saying, I don't want, we don't need another word. We have our language, and we already have, terms that define us. So it's just been interesting to hear that and where it's coming from, the social, economic, educational kind of a status that the people that are saying that in many ways. And also what you mentioned, kind of the resistance to accept it and see others represented in that term.
Yeah. That's interesting.
Yeah. So, I read something about an introduction about who you are as well in terms of your some of your identities, and I read that you are Mexicana, Cubana, Española, and Estadounidense, right? So, is that correct? You have all.
No, that's correct. I was born in Miami. My mom is Cuban, born in Havana. My dad is Mexican, born in Mexico. But when my parents separated, when I was very young, a lot of my mom's family had migrated to Cuba. And so, had migrated to Spain from Cuba. And so when my parents separated, she ended up taking me to Spain. And so I lived between Madrid and Miami, where I would see my dad. And so I developed in Spain this super thick Spanish accent. which is super confusing to a lot of people. They're like, but wait, but where are you from? So yeah. And so part of, you know, that's just the labels in my passport, no? But part of it is using all of these different hats, no? And then part of this conversation is that you can embrace all of those things at once. But growing up, I didn't, you know, it's not something that I thought I could do.
Yeah, no, totally. And so when I read that and I was thinking about other things that you shared throughout the book, I was curious to know who was in your mind when you were writing the book in terms of an audience. Like, who do you truly wanted to write this book for? Yeah,
I mean, it was a couple of audiences. The first one was us. No, I kept thinking about the stereotypes that I felt that I had to abide by when I was growing up. And I kept thinking about, like, you know, myself as a 10-year-old watching the telenovelas all day long. You know, my dad's a newscaster for Univision. And so I grew up with Univision playing on my TV all day long. And so I grew up with an image of what it meant to be Latina, of what it meant to love, that felt very different for me, And then I remember also one of the first times that I did that I was on TV with Telemundo. And I remember being, you know, sitting down in the chair, and the makeup artist came up to me and was like, all right, we're gonna redo this. And so I remember I was like, okay, fine. And so she starts putting makeup on me, and she's like, she told me, she's like, this is what you should look like on TV. And it was the image that I had seen on TV my whole life of, like, the Latina de la telenovela. And I remember in that moment, I was like, I'm never doing this again. Like, I am never changing who I am. No, I'm never lying again about, like, being gay or not. I'm never changing me ever again. And so part of the book is for anyone that has ever tried to break the stereotypes of what it means to be Latino, whether that is identity, whether that is the way you love, whether that is your accent, the way you speak, whether you have papers or not. There is no mold and no right way of being us. In fact, that is the beauty of us, that we're so diverse. But I think the one thing we have in common is that we have that immigration story in common that should give us the freedom to at least be who we are. So it was for those Latinos. It was for Latinos that wanted to sort of really step into their liberties and be who they are. But it was also a book for, you know, I spent a lot of years in politics. And so it was a book for, like, the white political world, to also understand that when you're going to all of these battleground states, when you're going to the Texas, Floridas, Nevada, Arizonas of the world, like, here's all the people you're not talking to, right? Here's all the nuances that you're forgetting to see, right? Here are the stories that go beyond the immigration narrative and the U.S. border narrative. In the Midwest, here's what we are and what we, in a percentage of what we look like. So a lot of the book is also driven. It was also targeted at them, at the political world that I was part of, that I thought I knew well, and I had to step out of the political world to see what I didn't see in years in politics.
Yeah, it was there through that experience of meeting all these individuals and traveling around the country and finding these stories. Was there one that was so very surprising to you? Because there were some for me, of course, when I was reading the book, and some that resonated and that I felt so connected to, like Ilia Calderon, she's kind of like, I study communications and broadcast television, and I wanted to be, on TV. I went to Telemundo in Boston when he came here. I did my work, but I was never that, image of the Latina in front of the camera, right? So I kind of like fought my way around it.
Yeah,
and realized at some point that no, it was too much of a barrier for me. And I'm passionate about, being myself and bringing my voice to a space where it's welcomed. So I, desisted of doing that. But seeing Ilia was like, to me, I follow her career. So it was so moving to see her story represented in the book.
Yeah, and I don't know if members of the audience know who she is, but for people that may not know who she is, Ilia Calderon is a co-anchor. She's a newscaster for Univision. And she is, I believe, still the only Afro-Latina to anchor a mainstream newscast, like the only one. And so there's a chapter in the book where I write about her. My dad is the other one. My dad is Ilia's co-anchor. And my dad looks like a white Mexican dude that's been on TV his whole life. And so, you know, even it took me even years to recognize like the impact, the powerful impact that Ilia was happening. And like not even in front of my eyes could I understand that like Ilia Calderon literally like had to leave, you know, one of the poorest parts of Colombia, and I was just there literally like a month ago, and I was in El Chocó. Like she had to break down so many barriers to prove constantly that someone that looked Black, could be a newscaster. And I just finally I had this realization when I just sat down with her and I was like, tell me how you got here, and what does it feel like every single day to be on that TV screen next to my dad and you know, having people tell you to look a certain way. And anyway, so that was impactful. But to me, one of the most impactful things was many things. Every chapter was like, I was pretty blown away by like the subtle little things that I would find. But for instance, like going to the border, I've been 1,000 times, but understanding migrations through the point of like the indigenous migrants that are coming to this country, right? And understanding what it means to cross the border or to be in the face of a border patrol agent and not be able to defend yourself in Spanish or in English, right? Because you're speaking a different language, como like mamo canjobal if you're from Guatemala. So that was eye-opening, but even more so, understanding this growing and thriving indigenous community that is in like the rural red Trump counties of Georgia. And I was able to embed with this like incredible growing like Guatemalan Mayan community that's there and that has been there for decades. You know, being in Florida, like a state, and being in Miami, a place where I grew up my whole life among my Cuban community, only to understand that my whole life I was never looking at all of the incredible and large and thriving Afro-Cuban community that was in front of me, and so having millions of conversations with them and to understand how we had, grown up in the same zip code, but in many different ways, and why wasn't I able to see eye to eye with them? And then also like a lot of, I think perhaps the most, not impactful, but kind of eye-opening chapter, because it sort of pointed to this larger movement of Latinos for Trump that we're seeing, was this conversation with the member of the Proud Boys, with Enrique Tarrio.
That was the chapter that got me. I was like, yeah. So I'm appreciative that it was included, because it's a voice that I don't get to hear often or ever. Yeah. But that perspective is just so completely kind of like opposite to mine, but at the same time so real.
Completely. And so again, for people that don't know, Enrique Tarrio was the chairman of the Proud Boys, right? And so Enrique Tarrio is a Black Cuban, who lives in Miami. And initially, I interviewed him for, a couple of stories that I did. And then I sat down with him for a while just to understand his perspective, right? Why did he take on this like Proud Boys position, and why did he love Trump so much? And anyways, and as you say, Rosario, like this is someone that on paper I could not see eye to eye. I couldn't understand. But then through him, I think there was this larger pattern that's happening across the country where like someone like Enrique Tarrio has been completely left behind in the system, right? He was always too Black to be a Republican, but then too wacky to be a Democrat. And he was sort of like left behind, and almost became a victim of the system, right? Not to give him too much credit, but almost became like a victim in a way that like he just, he sort of like disappeared from the establishment's eye. And then in Trump, right, what Trump has been really good at is that he was able to internalize racism to a point that a lot of people wanted to feel like they were never the other, A lot of too many Latinos in this country and immigrants in this country, including a lot of immigrants, want to forget, that they too were once immigrants, or that they too were once refugees. And that's real. And that can be extremely internalized. And so Enrique Tarrio was that. Enrique Tarrio never wanted to remember that his family too fled from Cuba. And when I would, bring up the new Cuban asylum seekers that are at the border right now, he would look at them in a different eye, in a different lens through his own migration story. And that pattern and that story is repeating itself all over the country. Mm-hmm. And so anyways, that was very eye-opening for me, just to at least have a conversation and understand like where that drive comes from.
Yeah, and as I was also going through that story, I was thinking about so many Dominicans in my communities right now that are connected to the same mentality because of religion. So many voted for Trump. Not only Dominicans, but Latinos there were a very a large group of Latinos in Massachusetts that, went in that direction because they felt connected to the messaging through religion and their beliefs. So that was just really interesting. And again, I really appreciate that you show us that perspective through the book.
And that's part of Latinx too, it's understanding that like, just because you're Latino does not mean you're a liberal. Just because you're Latino does not mean that you can't be racist or xenophobic. And that is also part of this conversation and this label. It's like that is very much there.
Yeah, and I know that you mentioned the audience of like non-Latinos for the book to learn kind of like our again mixed identities and everything that can be encompassed within the term. But I think it's also it was also a very personal journey for you, from what I can see. With some of the things that you share in the book, you talked about kind of like through the book about the coming out tale, and how that is also interconnected and intertwined with the emergence of the Latino community as a whole. Can you share a little bit more of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think so many people have grown up, so many young Latinos, I think, have grown up in this country viewing their parents sort of normalize in subtle ways, but normalize injustices, or say no to that, accept that, paying them less was like an accepted, was an accepted thing. As successful or not, I think every young person that I talked to, or just pretty much everyone that I talked to, had grown up understanding that like this normalized pain and normalized injustices were a given for their parents. And I think what I found in the book and what I found with all of these different stories is that there is this rejection to that. Like younger generations want to reject perhaps what their parents went through, having to assimilate, having to talk a certain way, having to accept less than. And I think part of Latinx, or at least part of what we're seeing now, is people leaning into their identities in a way that like perhaps our parents couldn't. Perhaps because they had less money, perhaps because of their status. But I think more than anything, because our voices are now like have become so much stronger. And so for me, finding Latinx and writing this book was like me coming out as a queer Latina that can be all of these things at once. So much of my life was like, all right, when I'm in this room, I'm going to talk a certain way. When I'm in this other room, I'm going to try and like hide my sexuality. When I'm in Mexico, I'm not going to talk about my girlfriend. When I'm around my Cuban family, I'm not going to talk about politics. And so that experience, people are having that experience in their own ways, in many, many, many different ways. And so I think Latinx at least like empowers people to like come out as undocumented, come out as trans, come out as whatever you are. And I always think about one of these things that Monica Ramirez, this amazing activist, told me once. She says, look, the difference between the older generation and us is that she talked about her mom. No, her mom's a farm worker, and she's like, my mom never felt like she had people to fall back on and to rely on. No, the difference now is that there's an army of people that we can fall back on. No, like I have your back and you have my back, and I think that's different. No, that feels different, and so that to me, like that's how I explain it, and I can see it. I see it in the way that politics is changing, that culture is changing, music, the way that the youth is speaking up in a way that I haven't seen it before.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I know the work of Monica and what she's doing is amazing. And I see totally that point. I see it in me, what I mentioned as I was growing up, that I didn't see those role models. But now my daughter, first generation, Afro-Latina, from Dominican parents, she has a community to fall onto. Like she has,
for sure.
Yeah. So that's definitely a point that I didn't think of before, but now that you're bringing it up, it's totally, totally true. And with that said, now there's this whole population of young Latinx that are pushing against all the norms, especially systemic racism in our nation. That they are redefining their identities. Mm-hmm. They are kind of like activating themselves and really being very awake and connected to the reality of our nation right now.
Yeah.
So how do you think we can keep this momentum going and continue providing that space for the younger generation to continue kind of like taking ownership and becoming empowered?
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you what I see from now, like storytelling, but I actually would love for you to share, since you're working at an institution that is striving for that. I mean, I feel like the momentum has never been higher. No, I feel like when I look at the way that young people organize in a state like Arizona, regardless of politics, no, regardless of you're a Republican or a Democrat, the way that young Latinos organize throughout the country in a historic way, and pushed and pushed Biden to the presidency is the truth. Obviously, along the side, like following the steps of Black voters. But I think the way that young Latinos organize in states like Arizona, in Nevada, in Philadelphia, I mean, in Pennsylvania, in Georgia, I think that that organizing is like, it's not new, but I can see the effects now. You look at Congress, now it's not just like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez again. You can love her or not, but she is changing politics, and she doesn't just talk about immigration. She doesn't have to say that she's Latina, right? Because she carries her identity everywhere, and that I think is also a difference. But now it's not just Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and then you have
the candidates are looking now very different, right?
It looks different, and then you have like Richie Torres. I'm talking to y'all from New York, and Richie Torres is a gay Afro-Latino, and he is now in the halls of Congress, making decisions. You turn on the radio, it's now suddenly Bad Bunny is more popular than country music. And maybe that makes sense to us, but for many years it didn't make sense like that. And so I think you look everywhere and things are changing. The numbers are there. And so then I would turn to you and ask you, as I ask everyone, you're right, how does that transform into actual systemic change? That's always a concern. That's always a question. How does all of this translate into real systemic change?
Yeah, so through the work that we've been doing, we're realizing that we cannot, affect systemic change and get where our vision is taking us unless we change policy, unless we get involved in advocacy. And we started as an organization that was more, community driven and kind of bringing people together, creating a space for networking and just, connections. But definitely given what we experienced, especially last year, not only with the pandemic, but also with all of the different, crises that we faced, especially racial crisis in our country. Definitely, we realized, okay, this is the direction that we need to go. We have to change in policy. We have to, change systems by having more representation politically and in decision-making roles throughout, across sectors, but also by empowering, our community to affect change through policy. So we're putting together a shared policy agenda for Latinos in Massachusetts, which is, a new kind of like chapter for us that we embark in, but in trying to, again, bring all of those voices that represent the Latinx community and who are those people. And we are, surprisingly and exciting to see, how many different identities are coming forward. And
that's the thing, right? And that's another big lesson learned from 2020. Like, we're everywhere. No, like it's no longer like the border states. It's no longer just the blue states. Like Latinos are everywhere. And I think that was always a takeaway from the book and just from everything. It's like, there is no winning strategy without us anymore. No, it doesn't, like, the numbers will never lead that way ever again. No, there's no such thing as winning policies without us, as winning elections without us, as having a successful campaign and company and business project without us. Like that story is gone. So
we also run an initiative that empowers Latino-owned businesses and create opportunities for economic mobility through investing in our communities, right? In our businesses. And one of the speakers we had last year in one of the summits there is Lily Hill Valera, and she talks about, of course, the economic power of Latinos, right? But how we can take our culture and shift, shift the course of this country in so many different ways, not only politically, but thinking about, private corporations and the power that we have to control where the economy can go. And I think it's something that we still, as a community, need to own, and so I hope that some of the work that we are doing and the great work that is happening across the nation is taking us there, because we are empowered. We should be moving towards more mobility and more growth as a community. So I'm shifting gears a little bit, and I just want to make sure that we are good with timing, but this is something that I want to learn. I'm an ESL learner, lifelong learner of the English language that is killing me sometimes. So for me, it has been a little difficult to adapt to the gender nonconformity terms that are also coming with, kind of like the movement of not only Latinx, but really, gender neutral pronouns and all of that. So can you explain, if you may, the importance of using the accurate gender neutral pronouns in Spanish, and what have we learned from explaining the gender nonconformity to Latinx individuals in our communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very easy to complicate these conversations, but I think at the end of the day, it comes back to the one thing I think we all value, which is like, how do you want to be identified? How do you want to be seen? And all it is about is just us respecting that. That's it. And so I think there's like 1,000 conversations to have about that, but at the end of the day, is like, it's the most simple question, which is, how do you identify? No, and there's some people that are gender non-conforming, non-binary, they are trans, and I think it's the least we can do, and it's our responsibility to always ask people how they identify and how they want to be seen in the world. And I always go back. I think there's this, like, I think there's also this like stigma that as Latinos we carry, where we think that we are closed-minded people and that, you know, our parents are, you know, conservative and like non-accepting. But, you know, one of the things that I keep finding is that I continue to surprise myself by how unreal that is. No, I think that story is so baked into who we are, that we're these like, you know, stick to traditional values, sure. But I think the love we carry, and that empathy is a lot bigger than I think we ever give ourselves credit. And I find it in the most remote random corners of the country, I found the most like open-hearted, like empathetic, welcoming human beings. And I always have to remind myself, because sometimes I've done so many stories where I'm like, okay, I'm gonna find this, and it turns out to be the complete opposite. You know, talking about like abortions in like the Rio Grande Valley in Texas, only to find that like Latinas there were having conversations in ways that like politicians couldn't, because, you know, they were embracing language perhaps in ways that others couldn't. Anyways, all this to say that I think it's a natural conversation to us, because what we're asking the country and the world is to ask us how we identify. So I think all it comes down to, like, how do people want to be identified and seen in the world and respected and loved?
Yeah, and I think, you know, outside, you know, it's a larger conversation, not only about gender, but for me, you know, it applies to my experience. I identify as Afro-Latina, and I proudly say that. And it has taken me a lot of like rediscovering and like sharing like different layers of my experiences to get to that point, to be able to even articulate that. I have lost, you know, connections with family members, with people that were very close to me, just for the fact that I'm you know, determined to identify myself as I feel connected to my roots. So, you know, I think that just having a simple conversation, as you said, and asking people, you know, in a very like, you know, open kind of like non-complicated way.
It's complicated with Spanish too, because Spanish is gendered, right? And so I think we just have to force ourselves that, like, the practice of being welcoming, which it doesn't take much, I think.
Yeah. So I think we are coming to an end in terms of our timing for this conversation. But I really enjoy having this opportunity to exchange these kind of like ideas and you know, all of these things that I'm just you know, learning at this point, and kind of trying to like understand and process, because as you probably can sense from all of my questions and kind of going from one thing to another, I'm still trying to figure it out.
Me too.
Sometime if I ever get there, right?
Yeah.
But thank you so much, Paola. I really enjoy having this conversation with you, and I know that James is coming back on because we also want to allow for time for questions from the audience. I'm sure they have you know, a lot of questions for you, Paola. So James, just let us know, how would you like us to take this on?
Yes, thank you so much. I'm back, and first off, I hate that I have to be the one to break that conversation up, because I think I could have listened to the two of you and share your experiences for so much longer. I loved this book, and I admire both of your work so much, and so I can't express how much of a privilege it was for us to be able to bring the two of you together tonight. And I think just on behalf of our audience, the love is already pouring in through the Q&A. I just thank you for allowing us all to share space with the two of you tonight, and for sharing your perspectives and insights. Questions are coming in, so we are just going to jump in and try and get through as many of those as we can. If you still have a question out there and haven't sent it in, you still have time to do so. Just go to slido.com, SLIDO.com, and enter the code Finding Latinx, all one word, just as it is scrolling at the top of your screen. So we're going to jump right in, and this, I think, is for both of you. Do you have any advice for dealing with pushback for using the term Latinx? I often have Latinos tell me I shouldn't use the term, or try to share studies with me to prove it's not a term generally understood, liked, or used by the Latino community. Thoughts on how best to respond?
Do you want to go first, Rosario? Okay, I mean, look, they're right in the sense that like the Pew study that they're probably referencing is the fact that, or it states that like less than 3% of Latinos use the word, and you know, at least 20%, no, less than 3%, yeah, like something like that. Like very, very few people use the word. That is absolutely right. But what I always think about is like, I think it's because we have been so conditioned to view ourselves in a certain way that when you pop up a term like Latinx, like people don't know that they are allowed to view themselves through that lens, right? Because we've never been demonstrated, a mirror has ever been held against us and shown us how diverse we are. And so it's very hard to talk in a language that you've never been educated to talk in. That's just sort of my initial response to that. I always think, just as a personal practice, and I always tell my friends, like if you can strive to include more people, like, and language can allow you to do that, always opt for that, always. And then when I have these conversations with like people that like really like think that word is like super insulting, like at some point my grandpa did too, I always personalize it, you know? So I make the X less scary for people, right? It's like, look, I'm queer. I would feel better if you use this word because XYZ, or like that person, grandpa, that is Black and Cuban, just, you know, Cuban just like you, like that person perhaps would feel more included, you know? So do it for that person, or this transgender person that you know, also would feel more included, you know, her, like, so I try and just personalize the scariness to them, and then suddenly it's like more, it's like it becomes less scary.
Yeah, I agree. That's kind of like the approach I have taken as well, especially now that I'm leading this work at Amplify. I mentioned earlier that we get messages all the time, and now people are seeing me more in the role, and I'm more visible. But before, it was kind of like behind the scenes. So they will assume that I'm also like a white Latina that is running this organization. And then I just I humanize it, you know, I make it about me. And I say, well, in my perspective, like this is, you know, as an Afro-Latina, this is how I'm seeing myself represented in this work. And I feel like once I do that, I agree with Paola, you know, the kind of like the conversation shifts a bit, and people are more open, not necessarily all the time open to just embrace it, but open to learn and to kind of like try to understand and try to put themselves in other people's shoes.
Wonderful. Let's see, Paola, this one's for you. Were there any stories or individuals that you encountered on your travels that didn't make it into the book, but that have stuck with you?
Oh my God, no, yeah, there were a lot of people. I did not include, I tried to include most people. I spent a lot more time with like younger folks in Florida, like Carlitos. Carlitos is one of the Parkland students that, you know, after the like massacre happened there, he became a pretty big figure in trying to include the like young Latino voices in like the Parkland movement, and so he wanted them to be part of the conversation, and because mainstream media wasn't really like including them. And so I did, you know, I had a bunch of conversations with him, like we talked on the phone a lot, and you know, and through him, I think, Rosario, as we were talking about this idea of like the perpetual foreigner, like through him, I was able to understand a lot about like the mental health crisis that a lot of young Latinos are going through. And it's very like subtle, and it's very hard to pinpoint exactly what is causing it. But through Carlitos, you know, someone that had, you know, lived through Parkland and had lived that like awful shooting, was also an immigrant, had family in Venezuela, you know, was coming of age in this country. Like he showed me a lot of what it means to live in limbo and what it means to be like, you know, struggling so much, but also at the same time trying to be like a leader and an activist, and part of the Gen Z generation. And so I wish I could have included more of his story, just because he's just like an incredible person. I think touches on like a lot of larger things. So that's one example of someone. Yeah.
And so for both of you, have you seen the term Latinx used more in certain countries, age groups, or genders than others? Why do you think that those differences exist? So Rosario, any initial thoughts on that?
I'm definitely, again, through the trends that we've been following and what we're seeing through our work, we have a certain lens where we might not be as inclusive with this. We see it in younger generations, younger groups, and also I would say not so much outside of the United States, not so much in Latin America. I think a lot of the resistance that we get about the term comes from more of the nationalism that we carry sometimes here in this country and outside of this country. And also, that's another thing, like we didn't talk a lot about that, but within our own Latino communities, like all of the things that are separating us, and a lot is about that also, kind of like identity about the country that you're coming from, and especially for kind of like newer immigrants or first, second generation, but definitely younger, more open, more inclusive, more connected to kind of like being civically responsible, and yeah, more interested in creating some sort of a difference in movement and being more connected to systemic change and collective impact.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add is yeah, you're right. Like I see in this moment, I think Latinx is the story of the Latino growing up or living life in the United States. Like I see it as an extremely US centric word completely, right? Because it is what it means to be us in this country, in this time, with these politics, in these systems in place. And so it is, to me, it's like the very much the story of the United States in that sense. I have never heard, in fact, most people anywhere in Latin America will completely reject the term. But I've never thought of it as a term that tries to sort of like go beyond the border. Although I do see a lot of similarities, like there's a lot of trends that are happening all over Latin America with different types of movements, and there's a lot of cross sections there. But yeah, to me, it's a very much like, it is a story of a Latino in the United States. And I think you're right. Obviously, I think younger people are using it. I think it says a lot, right, about like, there is a generational divide for sure. Yeah.
And so the next question, well, we have a lot of questions coming in about the current pandemic and the effects that COVID has had on the various Latinx communities. Do either of you have any insights, either sort of anecdotal or research-based, on how the communities have been affected over the past year or so?
I mean, I think the CDC right now, I think the latest I heard is that Latinos are more likely to be infected, hospitalized, and die of the virus than any other demographic except for indigenous folks in this moment. Wow. And then, I mean, it's been absolutely devastating. I think there was someone in Texas, a doctor in Texas, that compared what we're seeing to the like decimation of the Latino community, like as we know it, right? Just because it has taken away so many people, and also like so much of what I think has been one of our biggest weapons, which was community, right? Like we thrive in community. We thrive through hugs and through being connected and through being in family. And I think COVID took that away. And I think that number one, like that's the story. But I think the larger story is I think suddenly this country exposed one of the biggest hypocrisies that we've seen, which is the fact that like the essential workers that got us through the pandemic, the majority of them were Latino and undocumented, yet we're not being protected by the government, right? Mm-hmm. And the amount of farm workers that died, the amount of, the amount of people on the front lines that were Latinos and that they're, got taken away by this pandemic is alarming. And so I think that contrast was very much in play throughout the entire pandemic of what it means to belong, but then this country not really protecting you.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. More, again, our work focuses more in Massachusetts, and the Latino community in Massachusetts is one of the most affected in the country in terms, because we are one of the demographics in the nation that is, facing most of the economic challenges that are so consistent with communities that are low income, Black and brown. One perspective that we have seen that, besides all of the things that Paola mentioned, is our small businesses. The local economic crisis has been, like we have seen through our work, generations of wealth just disappearing in front of our eyes. And it's, I keep on saying that because it's like so heartbreaking, like so much hard work, it just disappeared just like that. So a lot of the work that we have been trying to do is create some opportunity for bringing funding directly to micro businesses in our Black and brown communities and helping to boost, that sector. But so many have closed, and it's more about how can we support the ones that are, barely there, and provide that, opportunity for capital and investment as we are looking at the reopening phases. But we definitely seen a lot of challenges with our small business community in Massachusetts.
So a lot of questions about identity and sort of the difference between race and ethnicity. And so one of them is, as Latinx born here in the US but parents from Mexico, I never know how to answer the race and ethnicity question. I check off Hispanic, but then nothing else applies. So if I'm ethnically Hispanic, what's my race? I keep seeing different approaches to how we should respond, in quotes.
Rosario, you should take that one first.
Yeah, no, it's like I'm there with that person that posted that question, because it has been one of the most symbolic things that I can relate to when I started to question my identity and who really, which box to check. It started with my first interaction with the census, and kind of like, where do I go? And I remember other members of my family, when the outreach worker came to our house with the census form, he said, well, you're Black. And we were like, no, we're not. We're Latinos. And he's like, no, you are Black. So kind of like trying, and we were like, no. And it was kind of, that question of like, no, I'm okay. I'm dark skinned, but there's so much more. and how can I, put that into a box? And so that's where I started to look at the Afro-Latino term and advocating for having that included. But at the same time, many times it's like a personal, again, it's a personal choice. But I've done even multiracial, depending on the form, or I write it down, like this is who I am. So it's just, it's a personal journey, I think. And you get to a point where you feel comfortable with choosing the box or not. And then where does that take you,
Yeah.
Any additional thoughts, Paola?
No, I think Rosario captured it perfectly. And I guess the only thing I would add to that is this, even when researching this book, like something as simple as trying to find like data on Latinos in the criminal justice system was so hard, right? Because there's not enough, you leave off so many Afro-Latinos, right? Or so many Latinos that perhaps identify another way, because the boxes aren't there for people to identify the way that they want to. And so that just came to mind right now, where I was like, it's so much data and research is missing, so much on many different aspects, because of that, right? Because there's not enough boxes, or there's not the right boxes. And so that's like for a whole other project to do, but
yeah. So again, for both of you, what advice would you give to young Latinx kids that are feeling disconnected to their ancestry as they are more removed from the culture, being third generation and further? They have a desire to connect but aren't sure how to embrace it and combine with their American side.
You want to take that one first?
I don't know. I mean, I don't think there's like a. I don't think there's like a right way to do it. I think it's also a very like personal journey. Like I always go back to that what I was mentioning before. No, this idea. I'm always thinking, even to the point where I'm like, is there such a thing as a Latino community, right? Like I even have been questioning myself, like, is Latinx truly? I'm like, is Latinx even a thing? Like, why did I just write this whole book? Like, are we even one, truly? And then I go back to that one thing that we do have in common as a community, which is that ancestor, you know, someone in our lineage, someone in our family tree that migrated to this country. That is the one thing we all have in common. And I always end up going back to that in that answer where I'm like, all right, let me find that root for me, because someone else has the same root. And at the end of the day, those stories are all connected. That person that came to this country, they all came for the same reason, right? Which was to provide for something better, which was to gain a little bit more liberty for something better, a little bit more freedom. And like that to me is like the connective tissue. And so I think it is really important to like look back and understand like your roots and where you come from, because it is the most American thing ever. Like this story was built on that idea, right? Like at least we've been told our whole lives, like that is the American story. I believe that is the most American thing ever, not to look back and look back. And I think the beauty of being a Gen Z or third, fourth, fifth generation is that like you can look back, right? Like you don't have to be scared to look back. You can embrace it in a way that your grandparents or bisabuelos could not. And so I don't know, I always encourage it. But I can like, I have a lot of cousins that are like full on, like only speak English and are now going through the same thing of like wanting to look back. And I think it's beautiful. Like, I think it's worth it.
I think so too. I think it's so worth it. And throughout this whole conversation, I keep centering myself, in my experience into this conversation, because that's exactly what I've been doing. And so many of my peers and my colleagues, people that are, kind of like are around the same social cycles as I am, we're doing the same thing. We are kind of like unlearning a lot of stuff, learning other new things about our roots that we never knew, and at the same time embracing it. Like we are, I would say that the way I approach it is, it might sound cliche, but really being kind of like centering in love, like loving who I am, owning it, but at the same time loving our stories, and taking the time to really explore them and learn. We have now so much technology and so much access to so much information, that we can start learning and unpacking a lot of stuff. I do that again through the lens of Afro-Latina and learning my roots, and understanding what Afro-Latinidad is. But also all of the, kind of like other pieces that come with that through my heritage, colorism in the Latino community, and how can I self-educate myself around that, so then I can continue educating others. And I think, again, yeah, I agree. It's a personal journey, and you kind of like start going through it at your pace.
And sort of on that note, for anyone out there watching who wants to learn more about the term Latinx, do either of you have any resources that you would recommend to read or to watch? Besides this book. Which you can go and pick up.
But a lot of my, like, I think the number one, like, Ed Morales, he has a book. Ed Morales is a great scholar who sort of goes into a lot more of the history, and it's like a scholarly like piece of work. So I would encourage anyone to just start reading Ed Morales, because he's great, and you'll learn a lot.
Yeah, for me, again, I wanted to kind of like, I went into data first, which is not, we just talked about how difficult it's like to identify ourselves through a lot of these forms and surveys, but I wanted to see what the numbers reflected. And then from there, I kind of like started to look into stories and really finding, kind of like what, where those stories were also reflecting in the sense of who these individuals were. And if I found that connection, I would say again that your book, Paola, I needed it. And as I continue through this exploration, we need more of those stories coming forward and really bringing up those narratives and creating the space for having these exchanges so we can continue growing and exploring these identities together.
I agree wholeheartedly. And so I think this is a great question to end on for both of you. What advice do you have for young Latinx folks who might want to follow in your footsteps as a journalist or a writer and or a community leader? So any advice for any up-and-comers out there?
So I guess the thing that I always bump into, that I have in my youth, and I still not, I mean, I'm not that old, but I'm getting there. And that I feel like my sister has gone through it, my friends have gone through it, is like the severe imposter syndrome that you're bound to feel, especially if you're like, look different, sound different, come from a different background. Like the imposter syndrome has been so real for me every step of the way. And so ignore that completely, always. And I wish from an earlier time in my life, I wish I could have like sort of owned these identities and owned what I wanted to do without doubting myself so much. And so I would just, if that voice comes, ignore it. And yeah, that's it. I would start with that for sure. That's
great advice. And how about you, Rosario?
I think I would go along the same lines with really owning who you are. And, for a long time, I tried to conform into other labels that other people were giving me, and I know that takes time to get to a point where you feel confident to kind of like go against the current. But the sooner you can do that, the better. Like I feel like now, Paola, I'm older than you, so I'm getting more faster than you there. So I don't know. I feel like I don't have to explain. I just do, and I follow my passion, and I'm a passionate anti-racist change agent. And so that's why. So I keep my eyes, with that vision, and there are spaces that I know that I can disrupt, and there's others that I just chose not to anymore to try to find my way into them and create my own spaces. So that's kind of like, if the sooner, the earlier you can do that, you feel like compelled to do that, do it. Just go for it.
Great. That's a perfect button. Were you going to say something, Paola?
No, I was just like taking that in my ears for sure.
Well, I can't thank you both enough again for being a part of this evening and letting us witness this exchange. It's been such a joy to get to spend time with both of you, and I really do hope that when the world allows us, we can bring you both together again on site here at the museum for a follow-up of this conversation. Until then, though, this was such a pleasure. Everyone out there, make sure you go and pick up a copy of Finding Latinx if you haven't yet. Make sure you follow all the incredible work that Amplify Latinx is doing here in Boston and Massachusetts. Yes. Anywhere that books are sold, pick it up if you have not. How could you not after this conversation? So thank you both again. I want to thank our friends at MOS en Español and the Lowell Institute for making tonight possible. And thank all of you out there for spending your Wednesday night with us. We hope you will continue to do so, especially for tomorrow night. We're back with a wonderful performance event in collaboration with a local artist and musician named Jeannie Santiago, who is incredible, and you won't want to miss all of the surprises she has in store. So details on that will be coming up on your screen as you exit the virtual venue, and we hope to see you then. Until then, everyone stay safe and have a wonderful night. Thank you both again, and we hope to see you soon.
Paola, un placer. Thank you so much.
Gracias por todo. Bye.
Bye.